Everyone, welcome to New Church Nation podcast. My name is Cal Ellerby. I am the church planting catalyst for the Apostolic Church of Pentecost. Our objective is to bring to you practitioners and educators that will help you become effective in establishing faith communities within your own context. Ken Parker is one of my most insightful friends when it comes to church planting and the challenges of our day and our time. So I look at three things that make the shift towards movement being significant and being a challenge. First one is I look at it and I go, we in our traditional churches don't have a deep commitment to disciple making. We speak to it, but our programs don't define it. They don't.
Can I interrupt you just for a sec on that one? Because people would push back on that and say, "Oh no, we have discipleship programs. We introduce people to the church. We got discipleship 101, 102, and 103." But what we're talking about there is all information, and information in and of itself is not bad, but there's nothing that I've seen in most of those models. Somebody that's listening to us might have one, but I have never seen where it's not discipling.
Agreed.
And so carry on.
Yeah. Anyways, we can talk about that at greater length. But the second thing is the redefinition of the purpose of our facilities and our venues. We can look at them as being sort of the albatross that we're all hung with, that somehow we have to keep the doors open in order to pay the bills and keep this thing. One of the churches that I worked with is that they have a $250,000 budget, and $100,000 of that money goes towards insurance and utilities. So you got over a third of their budget going towards just paying the bare essentials to keep that facility. So somehow we have to reimagine what could those facilities actually be used for, and that they could actually become a means of evangelism. They can become a means of community engagement, a lot of different things. But that's a big step, right? It's hard for people to see past the fact that we have $25 million worth of property being used at a maximum of 4 or 5 hours a week.
Right. And so when you think about the reimagining what properties could be used for, so when we talk about microchurch and we talk about the hub and we talk about, the hub in the community, because that property is right in the middle of the community. Yeah. So people say to me, so what happens if people don't tithe any longer, right? They're in a microchurch and they're not. Well, understand when we're talking traditional model, we're talking a gradual shift. Because there can be a lot of people.
We're talking about the who's serving who, right?
Exactly.
So if the hub is serving our faith communities and they recognize the value of that, then supporting that is not a problem.
Right. And one of the values of the microchurch model and the movement model is co-vocational work. So in other words, the hub isn't having to put out a lot of money. You say, well, you're in a plant. It should. It kind of comes without qualification. But let me say this: after Dave and I rolled out, the vision, the strategies, all that kind of stuff, you were there and helped us craft that too. And at the end, when we were crafting it over that weekend, I said, all right, boys, so what's our goal? What are we shooting for? And we landed on 20,000 people in 1,000 microchurches. Mm-hmm. That was our goal. That is still our goal. I mean, obviously I'm disengaged from that, but that's our goal. That was our goal. And because we had helped walk the church through a whole stage of getting there, I kept saying, like I said, here's the audacious goal. And this looks like, how on earth you're pipe dreaming? How would this ever happen? You have to shift from addition to multiplication. when you shift from we said we wanted to do that in 10 years.
Yeah.
20,000 people in 1,000 microchurches in 10 years. Because to me, that's the proof of concept. Show us this can happen.
5 years ago, I felt like God gave me a very clear word that we were to plant 3,000 churches in the next 10 years across the country. And my answer was, I don't have enough leaders for 3, never mind 3,000. Most people have heard me say this, but the Holy Spirit whispered into my heart and said, most of your leaders aren't saved yet. In other words, stop looking in the current pool. Not that, I mean, if they're there, then, call me.
Sure, of course.
But we're not going to do those kind of numbers if we continue to think the way that we've always thought. And that is making sure that we have a decent facility, we have good pastor, good leader. We just have to change the way we think. But the facility piece is the thing that, is so addictive. If I could just get a good building, whatever.
Yeah. So here's the thing. And again, this is why buildings aren't out of the question and facilities aren't out of the question. It's just, what are we doing with them?
Exactly.
So when people say to me, well, what if we start losing tithe? And you would eventually, obviously, if people are giving to their microchurch for their mission. That's a whole nother subject of the components that go into a microchurch. But if they're fully engaged in their mission, they may be putting their money into that. I would expect so. So you say, well, how are we going to survive? Like you said, you got to pay the bills. Well, that's when because I said this isn't going to happen overnight. You got time for the transition. So start thinking now and work with your board and work with your elders. What could we do with this property? Like, could we put daycare in here? Could we put a coffee shop in here? A viable for-profit. I'm talking about for-profit enterprises. What if we did this here?
Entity.
Exactly. That's all about community service, because here's the thing. When you do that, you're also making yourself that whole resource accessible to the community. In other words, there's a lot of connections that are going to happen there. When you talk about your future leaders that aren't believers yet, they might be walking into the coffee shop and somebody from the church sitting there, and they strike up a conversation and build friendship. What do we do? What are we going to do with this thing? And most people, say, well, let's do a big, community. I'm talking about for-profit community youth stuff. And there's all kinds of grant money, all kinds of ways that you can make that happen. Say, let's do that. Well, most people are worried about whether or not they're going to wreck the carpet or put a hole in a wall, not about what are we actually doing here.
So you introduce the possibility of church leadership and the vision, figuring out whether or not this is a viable way of doing church. So the first thing I think is that we need to be clear on the purpose and the existence and the responsibility to be a multiplying, disciple-making entity. The second thing is, what are we going to do with our facilities in light of that vision? And thirdly is the challenge that is before us in terms of communicating and effectively convincing high-level influencers into embracing and adopting the vision.
That's the big one.
That is the big one. So, you and I have both been involved in more challenging environments that we care to even talk about, and came away in some ways empty-handed, because the challenge associated with that is huge. Talk to me.
But you know what? The first thing I would say is, and maybe I should have said it earlier, when I say the traditional church model, and I personally think it's no more than 30 years. I think I'll be surprised if we're not forced into it a lot sooner. Just because, you take all of the social reform stuff that our country is going through, all without getting into that subject, but a lot of the goofy nonsense that's happening. we may be forced into this sooner than we think. And just because existing models, are not for profit's not going to make any difference in our country in a few years, I don't think. It's just, especially
look
not
at most of our
church-wise.
congregations, and I'm not critical of them in any way, but the grayhead versus the under 30 tender is not that there isn't any under 30, but it's disproportionately out of focus.
It is totally. So, but here's what I maybe should have said earlier is when I say it's got a shelf life, one of the reasons I feel that is because I don't think this multiplication stuff, disciple making and church planting movement stuff, I don't think it's a trend. I don't think it's the latest thing off the shelf. We'll do this for a few years and then there'll be something new. I honestly believe the breath of Jesus is all over this. And I have an advantage that some don't, and that is that I started getting into it in the 90s. So it's not something new, right? And I can, again, we don't have time for that today, but I can take you, way back to the early 1900s and show you the progression of what happened, including establishing fivefold ministry and all kinds of things that brought us to the place where we are, where we say this model could actually work. I think Jesus is behind it. And I'll tell you, one of the ways that I evidence it is the fact that it's the young generation that want in on this.
Yeah.
They don't.
And it's amazing
wherever
you go to preach, whenever we speak at a church or involved in conversations with people, there is always a literal, and I say this without, I think, being exaggerating, there's always a collection, even a lineup of people that say, we agree. We want in. How do we do it? What do we do? How do we engage? And I don't care both of us have gone from sea to sea in Canada and talked to places and people. It's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
I believe this, that I know that you and Daniel Strickland said that we're in the middle of a reformation.
Thank you for pointing out that I said it first. Just all joking aside, when COVID hit and we were shut down, I was praying into that, like, Lord, what are you saying? What are you doing? And the Lord's, I think it got recorded and might have been done nationally, but when I was seeking the Lord on it, he said, you are in the throes of a reformation of the magnitude of Luther's Reformation. Yeah. Luther's Reformation was a theological reformation. This Reformation will be an ecclesiological reformation. Agreed. And that came. Now I know I got a bias, and I've kind of stated that throughout this interview. Obviously, I have a bias, and I have lenses that I'm looking at. Words that come to me in. But you couldn't escape that. That you're in the throes of a reformation, and the churches shook with the first shakings of God in this reformation. And I remember pleading with people, Cal, pastors and leaders, please don't try to maintain what you're already doing. This is an opportunity to get wind in your sails to try something different. So
the conversation that we just had about the inevitability of the shift over the next 10, 20, 30 years, I think that 30 years is way out there personally. But the inevitability of the demand that shift is going to have and have to be met with is the defining piece in all of this. This isn't going away. Unless there was a coast to coast, one end of the continent to the next wave of Holy Spirit movement where all of our churches were refilled, I would be like, that would be so awesome, man. I would be at the front of the line running to the altar. But sociologically, generationally, politically, economically. We're in the midst of profound change and profound shift. Therefore, I was just going to say, therefore, we have got to figure out what is God doing in the midst of that, as opposed to hoping that that will all change and we'll come back to what we've always done. The reality is that there's very little support for our traditional model in the New Testament. I think that it's worked beautifully for 150 years in North America, but it doesn't mean that God married that thing and said that, everything else has to fall away in order for this to be sustained. It's not true.
Yeah.
What we do know is that God raises up individuals and people. And I believe that this particular time in history, whether it lasts another 10, 20, 30 years, will prove to be maybe the most significant move of God in modern Christendom.
I believe so. How could it not? You see, people ask, I've been a revivalist most of my ministry life. And people talk to, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. In the context of being, what was I just saying, Cal? Help me with it.
Well, we were just talking about the...
oh, yeah, I got it back.
Ecclesiology.
So people talk to me, about revival as a move of God. And I've done classes where I've said, tell me what you think a movement is, like a move of God is. Like, let's write out the components of that. Because most people, especially our generation, think about it, well, it's a move of God. It's filling up doing exactly what you just described. But what if 20,000 people in 10 years, is there not a move of God in there?
Thank you, Jesus.
And like that, what would you call that? It might not look the same way. Having said that, once a month gatherings to celebrate together. Those people are all bringing their friends. Well, this is who I'm connected with, all kinds of unbelievers. So what happens, the top, for an event like that, you'd have your top 5% that are capable of preaching or talking to that. So you get your heavy hitter in there and they just drop a great gospel word or whatever. And a whole, like hundreds of people come to Jesus. So now what? Well, now we're putting those back into the micro churches, and like, because no, you don't come. No, there's nothing here at the hub next week. Sorry, you got to be. We're going to connect you with micro churches.
And that to me is maybe we can finish with this talking point, is that the elevation of the individual that's sitting in the church now, watching what's going on at the pulpit and everything else, being recognized for the gifts that they have, for the call that they have, all of the different people coming together with bringing what they've got. I believe this is that not every person, but many people are sitting in the pews saying, what would God do with me? How would God use me? What would that look like? Instead of just, believing that my mandate is to show up at church on Sunday and give something in towards tithes, what would it look like if God was to use me in mission?
Yeah.
And I just think that if we could begin to raise that awareness, it's like throwing gasoline on the fire.
It would. This happened to me in late 90s, early 2000s. Before then, I had always read Ephesians 4. The fivefold ministry is given for the perfecting of the saints for the work of the ministry. And when I read that, I read it through a church lens, a traditional church lens. Right. So you know what? My job is to help people for the perfecting of the saints for the work of the ministry, like ushers and board deacons and elders and children's workers and youth workers. I didn't see it outside the church.
No.
So what you're just saying, can you imagine a person in pew, being told, well, we're going to help you discover not only what your gifts are, but what your place might be of service outside the church. And this is how. And now my role had once I saw that, Cal, it changed everything for me, because it was no longer about, well, let's see, I got to get you to be an usher. Well, sorry, I'd like to have you as a board member, but we have enough for now. So after a while, dude who's a high level leader is kind of tired of just being an usher. How do I get involved? Well, let's talk about it.
It's such a shift. I mean, each of the last 3 years doing camp meetings, at the end of sessions, I would have older ladies, younger couples, farmers, business guys, all come and say, you know what, we whatever it is that you're talking about, we agree, and we want to know, how do we get to be a part of it.
That's how you know it's got the breath of Jesus on it.
And that's from one end of the country to the other, isn't it?
Yeah, totally is. And the biggest hindrance to the breath of Jesus on anything is fear. And because I always say that, I was going through this continually when I was leading in this stuff, is that my early responses to crisis is to go back to default settings, because I understand default settings, right? So, okay, I'm out here in a new venture doing this microchurch stuff. Yeah, it's not going so good. We'll hang out a shingle and sing a song and get a guy to preach and see how it goes. That's default settings, and fear is what drives me. I'm talking about Ken Parker, back to default settings. If I let it happen, that's what'll drive me back and go, oh, Ken, you're out so far out on a limb here. Like, yeah, you are far out on a limb. I find Jesus is on most of the really tippy stuff where the sparrows are. Yeah. It's like that's where he stands. He can walk on water. He can hang out at the end of a branch.
I think a sparrow. The cool thing is that, so I read the book Cell Groups or Churches by Youngie Cho, whatever that was, Cell Groups, I think it was called, or Cell Church or something. I actually had the privilege of being in his church, I don't even know how long ago, 20 years ago. But I remember reading that and being so impacted by the concept. And then the master plan of evangelism, again, 1981, 1982, whatever. We're talking 40 years ago. And all of that stuff was apostolic voice for kingdom realities and kingdom change and shift. So I think we need to encourage people to believe that, or to be aware that this is something Jesus is doing.
Exactly.
This is not needing to be sustained by certain gifted, whether it's Dave Ferguson or Ralph Moore or somebody else.
Right.
It's not needing to be sustained by those gifted individuals or Ken Parker or whoever else.
That's the whole reason for doing that. Or one of the biggest reasons is exactly that.
That we are looking to align ourselves with what God is doing, as opposed to trying to keep puffing something up or whatever. What is God doing today? And my encouragement to people is, you use the word fear. Do not feel like there's so much risk to making yourself available that it's dangerous. But rather allow yourself to listen to what God's doing and saying, recognize it for what it is, commit to being in alignment with it, and see what the Lord does in terms of opening next steps. Because it started a long time ago, even though it seems current, but the very early adopters saw it years and years ago. And it's now in many ways reaching an apex and where the baby's about to be born. I don't think the baby's born yet. Like you said about the proof of concept. what we see as a church on every corner now, in a building and whatever, and a sign and poor parking and all that stuff, that had a birth as well, long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're about to have a birth, I believe, and that God is going to. Yeah, it's cool. Yeah,
I got to back the train up just a little bit for a second, and with what you just said made me think of it. We talk about, this has been happening for a long time now, decades, if not a century, decades where we've been moving into this. But really think about it. Jesus had the best missionary strategy of anybody else that's ever lived on this planet. And Matthew 28 is what we're talking about. We're talking about the multiplication. Go and make disciples that make disciples. Those boys got that so clear that when you read the book of Acts, and if you look at it with an ecclesiology that accepts the whole idea of smaller churches, which is not hard to get there, if some of his letters specifically address it and say, write to the churches, right? And to the elders of Ephesus. So we know from history, the elders of we're talking about, they met in houses, they met in homes. And so you look and go, so the boys that heard this message, go and make disciples. One of the last things Jesus said, lo, I'm with you always. And I think he said one more thing, because I think he got halfway up. I think he called the angel down and said to the angel, would you talk to these boys? Like, after all this work, they're just standing here watching me.
Yeah.
Look, after years with them and all this talk and 40 days talking the things of the kingdom, could you ask them, what are they doing? What are they doing looking at us? Yeah. And so the angel asked that, and I can just hear Jesus go, did you hear go? Did you hear send? It's like, boys, you're beginning, like, quit your sitting on your duff looking for me and get out there and get her done. So he gave us the model. That goes back 2 centuries.
Yeah. It's exciting to imagine. So back to the 3,000 churches, and I just kind of scoffed at God. After I started to understand the concept of multiplication and the concept of getting smaller rather than bigger, because I think the 70s and 80s did us a disservice in some ways. Many ways it was a great addition to worship and everything else. But in some ways, we come to the conclusion that growing our churches at all cost, even if it's at the expense of somebody else, that was, acceptable and
boy, do we have stories at the expense of somebody else.
But so if we could shift away from always needing to get bigger. I had a board member say to me one time, yeah, that all sounds good, but how do we get them in here? I'm like, you just missed an hour of my, chatter.
We'll talk
about sending and going and doing and, but I do think that we're in the middle of something that God's doing, and it's exciting to be a part of. And I want to encourage people to listen carefully. Be careful about being bound by former paradigms that limit the potential of doing and seeing things in a different way. And having disciple making at the core and the center of God's missional call in our lives.
Yeah, 100% right.
Well, buddy, I told you we wouldn't go longer than an hour. We're already a few minutes past that, and you and I can do this forever, but we'll do it again if that's okay with you.
I look forward to it. Yeah.
Thanks.
I hope there's a good reason to do it again, that you had enough views that you thought maybe they'd be interested in hearing this old guy continue to talk.
Yeah, you know what? It's important to have you speak to it. So